Good morning to our online audience and to our audience here in the auditorium. We're very happy to have Professor Susan Gabriel from St. Anselm College with her talk, The Future of Philosophy, Part 2, What Happens to the Individual, Men or Box. Professor Susan, we're very happy to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is my microphone working? And,
I think it's just
okay, is that better? No,
a little bit closer.
that better? Ah, I see the microphone. Thank you very much to Professor Porta and all the people in the department that have made this conference possible and shepherded us around the town. Is it good?
I think it's just a little bit closer, Professor. It's really
Oh, okay, that's better. All righty. I just wanted to thank everybody and also say that I admire all the people who speak in a second, third, or fourth language. This is not easy, and I couldn't do it myself. I will start, and then I will have an immediate digression. In an earlier piece, I argued that in the wake of 2 world wars, the analytic continental divide has left us with 2 incomplete philosophical worlds. That a reconciliation is required for philosophy to become whole again. I have to pause because we know that we just heard from Professor Gabriel that the analytic continental divide is an unfortunate expression that he would like to get rid of. I can agree with him that the terms are not very useful because analytic is a methodological term and continental is a geographic term. On the other hand, though, I do think there's a difference. If you think about Quine and Chisholm and Russell and Moore on the one hand, and Derrida, Levinas, Foucault on the other hand, there are 2 different philosophical traditions right now. And I would say in the wake of World War II that we can talk about that. Here in this paper, I propose to show that a further reconciliation is needed, that between the subjectively oriented philosophy of Descartes' cogito and the objectively oriented philosophy of ancient and medieval substantialism. Another slight digression. Objective and subjective are slippery terms. Likewise, inner perception and outer perception, which are the terms Brentano uses, but they're slippery. But that's the language that we have, so we have to kind of deal with it. But I recognize that these are not as precise as I would like. I think we ought to see contemporary philosophy, indeed much of philosophy since Descartes, not as transcending, but rather as complementary to ancient and medieval philosophy. Each of these 2 philosophical worlds begins with one of the 2 possible philosophical starting points, outer reality or inner reality, and philosophy only becomes complete when these are properly distinguished and related. To this end, I focused first on Franz Brentano's later so-called reistic, R-E-I-S-T-I-C, reistic ontology, which provides an example from the roots of contemporary philosophy of a kind of Cartesian Aristotelianism, that is, a blend of substantialist outlook and phenomenological methods. Then I turned to a modern substantialist explanation of the nature of an individual substance, Aristotle's man or ox from the categories. Finally, I attempt to indicate a way forward in philosophy in which the advantages of the subjective outlook and of the objective outlook are both appreciated and realized. First, Brentano's realism. There is an abiding dispute in Brentano's studies as to whether he was fundamentally a modern thinker imbued with modern science, or whether he was rather a kind of neo-Thomist dedicated to the Aristotelian and scholastic point of view. The assumption, of course, is that these 2 are irreconcilably different. I am not sure they're irreconcilable, and I do not intend today to resolve the dispute in Brentano's studies, but I do think that Brentano's realism is best understood through an Aristotelian lens modified by a kind of Cartesian refraction. The clearest source for Brentano's realism is to be found in the Theory of Categories, a collection of posthumous writings edited by Brentano's student Alfred Castile. Many topics are covered there, and a number of late dictations by Brentano. He was blind toward the end of his life, and he dictated his works to his wife, who wrote them down. These range from a critique of Aristotle's theory of categories and of Leibniz and Kant on the topic of substance, all the way to a speculation about the true nature of the physical world, which is not at all what one would expect, by the way, but it's beyond the scope of this discussion, as we say in academia. I shall not attempt to enter into all these issues, but intend rather to focus somewhat narrowly on the issue of the nature of substance according to part of a dictation from the period 1912 to 1913, entitled Substance, and the dictation from 1916, entitled The Third Draft of the Theory of Categories. When introducing the concept of substance, Brentano uses a surprising example, and this is the first on your handout. Suppose he suggests that an atom could think. Then the thinking atom would be a whole, which if the atom ceased to think, would be reduced to one of its parts. But one could not at all say that its thinking would be preserved if the atom ceased to exist. If another atom were to think the same thing, it would differ from the first, not only qua atom, but also qua thinking thing. As a thinking thing, it would be individuated by the individuality of the atom. In such cases, the one part of the whole is said to subsist or to underlie the whole, and thus to be its substance. End of quote. Although certainly heavily influenced by Aristotle, in particular by the claim that, quote, the most distinctive mark of substance appears to be that while remaining numerically the same, it is capable of admitting contrary qualities, unquote. That's Aristotle. Brentano departs rather radically from Aristotle concerning the concept of substance, in that he construes it in terms of the relationship between a whole, that is, an accident, or property, characteristic accident, and its parts. For Aristotle, a substance is, quote, that which is neither predicable of a subject nor present in a subject, unquote. The explanatory device Aristotle uses is linguistic. Of course, Aristotle provides other explanations elsewhere as well. But for Brentano, the explanatory device is decidedly mereological. In other words, has to do with parts and wholes. A substance is possibly a part of a whole, and at that, a part which is necessarily such that it can continue to exist while other parts have been removed from that part, even if those other parts cannot likewise continue to exist apart from the whole. In Origens' formulation, roughly, a substance is a one-sidedly separable proper part of a whole. Substance is a one-sidedly separable part of a whole, and he calls the whole an accident. So he could have called it a characteristic, perhaps a quality, that's an attribute. In Brentano's words, this should be on your handout as well. Quote, now it is perhaps incorrect to ascribe mental activity to an atom, but there is a non-spatial substance within ourselves. It is contained in us as the substantial part of the one who is thinking, the one who is willing, the seeing, the one who is hearing, and equally so in each case. This substantial part distinguishes our own hearing from the similar hearing of another person, and for each of us it unifies the one who hears, the one who sees, the one who thinks, so on. The one who is now willing can continue to exist apart from the willing, but the willing cannot likewise continue to exist apart from the one. And so forth, mutatis mutandum, for the one who is seeing and the one who is hearing, etc. This one-sided separability is the mark of substance for Brentano. The whole of which a substance can be a part he calls an accident, and the relationship between substance and accident for Brentano is quite different from what it was for Aristotle. Yet the inspiration for the Brentanian account is Aristotelian to this extent. Anything that really exists is an individual or a collection of individuals for Brentano. And abstracta, such as thought, humanity, vision, hearing, and so forth, do not exist independently apart from the substance. Precisely what Aristotle would have said about Plato's However, Brentano's concept of substance also clearly owes a debt to Descartes' res cogitans for thinking thing. The difficulty is that Aristotle's concept of substance and Descartes' concept of substance are thoroughly incompatible. While the so-called Copernican revolutionary philosophy is commonly attributed to Kant, there can be little doubt but that it has its roots in Descartes and his search for certainty. Nor can it be doubted that Brentano, with his reliance on inner experience, philosophizes in the spirit of Descartes' cogito. And now to another thinker, a modern Aristotelian. In order to understand Aristotle's concept of substance without laboriously explicating the Aristotelian texts, it is useful to appeal to a modern scientific view of what a substance is in the Aristotelian sense. A good example of such an account is to be found in the 1988 work, Substance and Modern Science by Richard Cannell. By contrast with contemporary materialistic and linguistic accounts of what we mean by a substance, including the possibility that we mean no particular individual thing at all, Cannell shows how the Aristotelian concept sheds light on what exists in nature. It begins by thinking of substance not as something that is a part, but as something that has parts. Substances have this in common with machines and aggregates in general, but are also distinct from them by virtue of the unique relation to their parts. For example, the parts of a machine are first fabricated and then assembled, whereas the parts of an organism, a prime example of a substance, are produced simultaneously with the organism itself. Further, however, whereas a Brentanian substance retains its identity while becoming part of various wholes over time, without ever itself taking on or losing a part, an Aristotelian substance is quite capable of retaining its identity while it takes on and loses parts. To take the example of an organism again, this happens constantly through the processes of metabolism. In Cannell's words, quote, "A substance is that which exists in itself by itself, and not in another as in a subject. As such, a substance is an entity per se, whereas machines are entities per accidens, with parts, quote, joined to make an incidental unit. That is, the parts of a machine have been assembled and can be disassembled, their disassembly causing the machine to be incomplete or defective with respect to the sort of whole which it was intended to be. Remarkably, however, the substance, which is a human being, can lose some part, say an arm, and still be identically the same substance. The human being is a whole per se. Even at the level of less complex organization, substance exhibits unique features. Consider the chemicals of sodium and chlorine, elements sodium and chlorine. Each is a substance in its own right, yet when the two are combined, a new substance emerges, NaCl, salt, in which neither sodium nor chlorine continues to exist as such. The Aristotelian concept of substance is thus applicable to natural alterations of various kinds, chemical and biological. In the area of physics, Cannell quotes Sir Arthur Eddington to the effect that his desk, so far from being a solid substance, is rather like a swarm of gnats, according to science. And Cannell comments that we are not required to choose between the two, ordinary experience on the one hand and particle physics on the other, as long as we remember that the desk is not a substance as such, but rather a man-made aggregate of materials. That is to say, the desk is what Cannell calls an artifact, whereas a substance in the proper sense of the term is a natural thing, produced without the aid of human intelligence and volition. Further, we must bear in mind that both the desk we perceive and the physicist's desk are accessed by ordinary external perception, whether directly of the desk itself or indirectly by means of the equipment of modern physics. In no case is the desk we commonly deal with to be thought of as a mere appearance before the mind. However, because it is useful to science, whether physics or chemistry or biology, to view natural objects as aggregates, whether the wooden surface of the desk or a chemical or an organ like the eye, it falls specifically to philosophy to draw the distinction and insist that there is a profound difference between an artificial assemblage of parts on the one hand and a genuine natural substance, whether chemical or biological, on the other hand. The reason is that a substance belongs to a unique category of its own and is ontologically superior to an aggregate, in much the same way as Marcus Aurelius himself is ontologically superior to his statue. A little bit about inner experience and outer experience. At this point, we have come a long way from Brentano's atom that we think. Brentano refers to the non-spatial substance within ourselves, the one that thinks, and we might be inclined rather to conclude that the term substance, as used by Brentano or Descartes, has just about nothing to do with the term substance as used by Connell or Aristotle. Yet both would happily tell us that their philosophies are empirical, based on experience, and intended to account for what we experience. In the empirical intelligence, the human empirical mode, Connell tells us that he, quote, and this should be under, he proposes to show how the mind comes to understand unobservables from observables, following which he argues that philosophy is first of all a systematic discipline that bears on the real world, and therefore it is as well a discipline that depends on ordinary experience. Similarly, in discussing proofs of the existence of the unobservable par excellence, God, Brentano insists that the four proofs he accepts share a common method. None of them proceeds a priori, rather all are based on experience. Let me suggest that the equivocal term here is not only substance, it is experience as well. Connell tells us, quote, again on your handout, the word empirical, which one might take to imply contact with extrinsic realities, now is commonly employed to mean something that is only psychological, something that appears internally that cannot be regarded as putting us in contact with realities of any sort, end quote. By contrast, as an avowed naive realist, Connell is persuaded that we can indeed rely on our senses to deliver accurate information about the external world. And this is what he means when he says that we should adopt an empirical method. Just a side note, in a way, Connell is siding with Kant, not with Frege, referring back to our first lecture yesterday. Everything we know comes to us through the senses, in other words. Yet Brentano argues forcibly against naive realism. Quote, on your handout, it is not correct to say that we are acted upon by the primary object of perception. The primary object is different from the cause of sensation, though its appearance is simultaneous with its cause. Ordinarily, in perceiving, we are inclined to assume that something is the cause of the sensation and to identify this cause with the primary object, even after experience has taught us in the clearest possible way that the primary objects cannot exist in reality in the way in which they appear to us. We have great difficulty in freeing ourselves from this illusion. While Connell correctly attributes this phenomenological outlook to Husserl, Brentano's student, and claims that Spiegelberg and others failed to establish the objectivity of it, Brentano himself takes the more modern path, as indicated by Eddington's two desks, the swarm of gnats on the one hand, and the familiar solid table-like object on the other. Is the experiential basis of philosophy better provided by Brentano's emphasis on inner experience? Oh, I'm quite sure the desk appears to me, although I know that in reality it's different. Or is it better provided by Connell's unreflective outer experience? Or does Canal have the edge epistemologically because, as he points out, quote, the regularity of our experience suffices for us to recognize the abnormal. Furthermore, the same illusion appears regularly. Sticks at a certain angle in the water always look bent. Railway lines always appear to converge. The moon always appears to follow us, and at certain times it always looks bigger than the sun, etc. In short, quote, the regular is the standard against which we determine the abnormal, unquote, where the abnormal is the allegedly illusory, the occurrence of which casts doubt on the ability to perceive things as they are. Nevertheless, Brentano insists that we cannot even be sure of the existence of an external object when we perceive, that is, when we see or hear or touch something. Quote, again in the handout, it is certainly true of all our acts of thinking that their very nature is that of a passio. We're passive in the act. And we might even say that this is universally characteristic of them, since this would also hold true, for example, for seeing or hearing, which do not seem to stem from the mental. We could say that here, because a cause appears, it seems to be certain that an external thing can be a cause. Yet since this cause is presented with such a lack of certainty, we can surmise only that it is the thing, not that it is this thing or that thing, and thus we cannot say that it is some external thing, nor that the cause might not be within ourselves. End of quote. This represents an extreme of subjectivist thinking. Even Descartes, who arguably pioneered this mode, as I suggested above, was never so skeptical about our knowledge of the external. Check out Meditation 6, for instance. Why does Brentano draw that conclusion about the external? And why does somebody like Cornell proceed with confidence regarding things outside ourselves? Next, we look a bit at causality. Both the Britannian phenomenologist and the Aristotelian realist claim to be empiricists, and both insist that everything that really exists is an individual or a collection of individuals. The world should look pretty much the same to them, but it does not. One way to get at the reasons for this difference is to look at causality, specifically at the differentiation of causes according to Brentano and according to the Aristotelian account. Both accept material and efficient or agent causality. There is action, efficient cause, and something acted upon, material cause. Where they differ is that Brentano rejects both formal and final causality. Why? Essentially because his reism can do without them. As he says, quote, the assumption of the formal cause is connected with the failure to recognize that in the case of an accidental whole, no second part is added to the subject, and that only the accidental whole itself is opposed to the subject as part. The second formal part was thought to be added to the subject. The subject was then viewed as a material part, and the two together were thought to constitute a whole. The formal part, however, was a mere fiction. The so-called form of an individual is really just a property or characteristic of accident. And a property or accident is a whole with a one-sided separable part, the substance, that is, according to Brentano. Without the substance, the form is nothing. Further, quote, like formal cause, the expression final cause is a misnomer. The final cause was thought to be one of the external causes and the cause of coming into being. But it consisted in nothing else but that which an intelligent, efficient cause thinks of and loves, and believing it to be within its power undertakes to bring about. End of quote. Again, the purpose or finality is absorbed into the substance, the thinking thing. Like a property or accident is nothing, it is nothing distinct from its substance. This ultimately is what reism means for Brentano. Both formal and final causality are essential to an understanding of nature. Regarding formal cause, he tells us that the properties of a substance are rooted in the substance. And in a later work, Nature's Causes, he tells us that, quote, the existence of a principle in things which determines their species is what we mean by form or formal cause. Quote further, quote again on your handout, because in many or most species we cannot identify the principal operational capacities. Our knowledge of formal causes of organisms is limited. In inanimate substances, we must settle for the constant sets of properties by which we distinguish one from another, together with their material causes. Wherever the set of properties varies, so does the species. Which means that inanimate substances are less determinate in their nature and less knowable in themselves than biological species. We must say then that a formal cause is that by which something is what it is. And when we say by which, we indicate that the form is not that which is, but rather an intrinsic determinant of the individual or stuff which exists. End of quote. Thus, it is due to formal causality, that a kind or species of substance is what it is. And this holds all the way from the elements, hydrogen, oxygen, etc., to stuffs or substances such as metal, stone, water, sand. To living creatures such as insects, crustaceans, horses, humans, etc., differences in species or kind indicate differences in structure or form. Then ultimately, with regard to final causality, this is Connell again, and she'll be in your handout. Quote, it seems that we may truly say that only through ends or goals do we come to understand the whole existence of natural species, where whole existence includes not only the species, but also variations in populations of individuals within a species. Such variations proportion populations to different environmental circumstances, and so go beyond that which is common to and specifying of every member of the species. To say that an individual organism has such and such traits because it inherited them from its parents supplies little understanding of its individual traits, but an account in terms of ends or goals or adaptation, think Darwin, employs this ultimate principle of intelligibility, end of quote. So far from regarding the concept of final cause as a misnomer, Connell sees in it the key to understanding nature, in fact, the cause of causes. This is what substantialism means in Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, and more recently in Connell. Why the huge difference in outlook between a thinker like Brentano and a thinker like Connell? Surely one's philosophical point of departure will make a significant difference in the end. The subjectivist point of departure in Brentano leading, albeit indirectly, to intuitism, and the objective point of departure in Connell leading to the Aristotelian understanding of natural science. So my question is, who sheds light and where? There's a passage in St. Augustine's dialogue on free choice of will, where Augustine asks Evodius how he knows that he exists. And then he points out that even if he were somehow mistaken in thinking that he exists, it will still be true that he exists and that he knows he exists. This reflection is clearly akin to Descartes' cogito, although it far anticipates Descartes, and is followed by a discussion of the five senses and the inner sense, which is not phenomenological in modern terms. In summary, however, Augustine says the bodily senses perceive material objects, and the inner sense perceives material objects through the bodily senses. I would say that here we have a philosopher operating both subjectively and objectively, that is, both on the basis of inner experience and on the basis of outer experience. That is to say, instead of adopting one point of departure to the exclusion of the other, Augustine here employs both, each on its appropriate topic. What we see in Brentano's reism, however, is the adoption of the subjectivist point of departure to the exclusion of the other, the object. Substance in Brentano's reistic interpretation is what we encounter through any inner experience, what we necessarily know to be an existing entity, capable of entertaining all kinds of thoughts while remaining itself one and persistent. This leaves out of consideration substance in the objectivist sense, the object of external perception, the individual man or ox. At the same time, in Cannell's criticism of Husserlian phenomenology, we see the objectivist point of departure employed to the exclusion of the subjectivist, though not to the exclusion of inner experience. More on this than what follows. In denying objectivity that is true to the subjectivist outlook, it seems to me that Cannell risks missing the kinds of insights that can come from the phenomenological project. One odd example is provided by Brentano's theodicy, his arguments for the God's justice. Reistic ontology actually sheds light on the problem of evil in the following way. The question of how the evils in the world may be justified or defeated leads to the question, what exactly are the evils we are concerned with? They must in every case be creatures, that is, things created by God, since the problem of evil only occurs in the theistic context. And of all the things created by God, the only ones that can be called evil are conscious beings. Weather events and the like, that is, are only to be called evil insofar as they affect conscious beings. But a conscious being, think of Brentano's atom head thing, or the thinking thing, the res cogitans, is such that it is, according to Brentano, inherently good, considered in itself. Consciousness is inherently good, knowledge is inherently good, knowledge is inherently good. There may be a one-sidedly separable proper part of an accident that is evil, for instance, murderous rage. But considered in itself, thought is good in itself, consciousness is good in itself. This yields a very interesting way to think about theodicy. The values that evil violates, so far from being negated or defeated by the evil, actually determine what evil is, namely an ontological parasite, or as Augustine puts it, a privation. I have to pause there for a second because Gabriel, Professor Gabriel, told us to watch out for the word parasitical. And I just said that it's an ontological parasite. So I'm on thin ice. Still, one need not accept Brentano's or anyone's theodicy to know the intrinsic value of human beings, which is consequent upon their being regarded as individual conscious substances. Without using the term substance in the same way as either Brentano or Cannell does, Kant certainly arrives at the dignity as opposed to price of the human being by way of the noumenal center of consciousness. Of course, we just heard about this yesterday in Professor Krause's discussion on that. There's questions can be raised about whether Kant succeeded in this, but it certainly was his aim. The human being in Kant's terms is not reducible to a phenomenon or a set of phenomenal appearances, but rather possesses the unity of consciousness which makes experience possible. This outlook seems to me to be entirely dependent on a subjectivist point of departure, upon the Copernican revolution inherited from Descartes and much elaborated by Kant. Similarly, the claim by Levinas and others that ethics, rather than metaphysics, is first philosophy, is prompted by the same subjectivist point of departure, and no doubt in the wake of 2 world wars. The value of this way of seeing things cannot be denied. Much of continental philosophy, from Heidegger or perhaps from Nietzsche outward, adopts this, or onward, I should say, adopts this outlook. One could say something similar about much of Anglo-American analytic philosophy, since the emphasis on symbolic logic and on language relies upon what is essentially a subjectivist starting point. By the same token, however, the objectivist point of departure also provides insights that cannot be obtained any other way. The locus classicus for this approach is perhaps to be found at Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 85, Article 2, quote, the question is whether the intelligible species abstracted from phantasms are related to our intellect as that which is understood. Aquinas' answer is no. What does that mean? It's one of those translations of Latin that should have stayed in Latin, perhaps, because the English just uses Latin words. The question is whether what we know are our own appearances, or do we know things? And he asks the question, is it just appearances that we know? Aquinas says no. Aquinas says no, in direct contradiction to the phenomenological outlook based on inner experience, which essentially gives the phantasms, phenomena, appearances, pride of place, epistemology. Canal sides rather with the angelic doctrine. Consider the individual man or ox again. Aristotle had asked, what makes an animal composed of diverse parts act as one entity? Canal explores this issue by the light of modern biological discoveries. Living cells, for example, are capable of several unique activities: nutrition, the assimilation of food, growth, reproduction, healing. When cells divide, the product is not two parts of the cell, but rather two cells of the same kind, two whole cells of the same kind, each capable of the same original activities. Further, quote, when we consider cell division, we see that it cannot be classified either in the category of chemical change, as bringing about a new kind of substance like salt, or in the category of physical change, as producing only changes of qualities. Our hair turns gray. A chemical reaction produces end products that differ from the reactants, different molecules or atoms, whereas mitosis produces individuals of the same kind. The objectivist point of departure is essential to this insight, I think. Rather than doubting the reality of what appears to us to be happening out there, we investigate it in order to account for it, taking care to be faithful to the perceived facts. Natural science requires this, and so does philosophy to the extent that it aims to account for the external world of our experience. I conclude that we need philosophy to address both the issues that arise from a subjectivist perspective and also those that arise from an objectivist perspective. The truth is we have experience in both realms. At the same time, however, there is a priority to be acknowledged. I shouldn't have used that word. There's a little more. Priority of the objectivist view. In his Problems of Philosophy, Bertrand Russell argues that the correspondence theory of truth provides the criterion of truth, whereas coherence theory of truth by itself, although it provides a test of truth, cannot be thought to provide its criterion. As he points out, quote, minds do not create truth or falsehood, they create beliefs. And here's a quote from Bertrand Russell. Hence, although truth and falsehood are properties of belief, they are properties dependent upon the relations of the beliefs to other things, not upon any internal quality of the beliefs. End quote. My suggestion is that a similar priority holds between the objectivist and the subjectivist points of departure in philosophy. The objectivist is prior in somewhat the way the correspondence theory of truth is prior to the coherence theory. Without correspondence, there would be no truth. Likewise, without an objectivist starting point, there would be no subjectivist approach. This is true genetically, so to speak, that is, in the development of the human mind, and also logically, so genetically and logically. To take the genetic aspect first, think how babies discover the external world. Consists, among other things, of their own feet. They play with their feet in the same way they play with other toys. I do not mean to say that they should advance to the cogito between feedings. The contrary, they are right to treat their own bodies like external objects because they are by nature oriented to the external world. Then as time passes and we become philosophers of the sort, the external world remains the touchstone of a proper relation with reality. We take a child by the hand, for instance, and admonish it to look both ways before crossing the street, not because a speeding bus might be just a swarm of gnats, or worse, a figment of our imagination, but rather because we too, by nature, presuppose the existence as we perceive them of objects in the external world, and rightly so. Doubt comes later. Logically, any bracketing of the external world presupposes an external world to bracket. In discussing Brentano's reism, Origens would like to point out that Brentano was a mereological essentialist, whereas Aristotle was not. In other words, for Brentano, the parts are essential to the whole. Change the parts, and you have a different whole, a different entity. Consider the well-known problem of the ship of Theseus. This is discussed in Hobbes's Leviathan, concerning which we are asked to imagine that over time, every single part of the ship is replaced plank by plank. The question is, that we still have the ship of Theseus? Under mereological essentialism, the answer would be no. But in the case of an organism which takes on and loses, quote, parts continually, we rightly claim that it is the same organism over time. The parts are not essential to the whole. Its identity consists in something else, namely, for Aristotle, its form. We could say its formula. We might be tempted to say its DNA, but an organism's unity and persistence are more subtle than any strand of material that can be extracted from it. Seems to me that mereological essentialism is a necessary consequence of adopting the essentialist view, the subjectivist view, leading to what I would call a thin concept of substance, the reistic concept in which its accidents or qualities do not properly belong inherently to the substance. By contrast, mereological inessentialism is a necessary consequence of adopting the objectivist view, leading to what I would call a robust concept of substance, according to which the substance is itself capable of acquiring various accidents because of its very nature, its form. That is to say, subjectively, the substance, the thinking thing, appears simple, artless, changeless, participator in various wholes. That's the subjective view. But objectively, the substance of the organism appears complex, changing as it comprehends a host of possibilities over time. The difference between the two views is almost like the difference between looking through the wrong end of the telescope and looking through the right end, except that illustration oversimplifies. First of all, there is no right versus wrong outlook. Rather, there is a priority, I think, which allows for the legitimacy of both. Secondly, both outlooks are limiting to some extent. What you can see from the objectivist perspective does not include all of what you can see from the subjectivist perspective and vice versa. We need both. Ironically, we need both in order to be properly objective. Consider Descartes' cogito, I think, therefore I am. This is hardly a subjective claim, as we see in Brentano's reism. I'm sorry, skip the line. This is hardly a subjective claim in the pejorative sense, rather its objectivity is unassailable in cogito. Yet it has this limitation, as we see in Brentano's reism. The individual man or ox gets lost as an accident in perception. It becomes one who sees a man, one who sees an ox. Years ago, the late Burnham Terrell, one of the translators in English of the English edition of Brentano's Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, remarked in correspondence to me that Brentano, quote, went down a rabbit hole of reason. So he did. If we follow him there, let us be sure also to find a way out. And if we find ourselves philosophically more attracted to the inner or to the outer view, let us not forget the lessons of the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Susan Gabriel. Now we move to the comments by Professor Gabriel Ferreira.
Firstly, thank you so very much for the invitation. And I must say, firstly, that I had such a good time reading your paper, mainly because actually I wrote 2 or 3 versions of my comments because there's so many different things since on the fact that if Cornell's reading of Aristotle's metaphysics was right, or if how it affects the comparison with Brentano's reason and so on, or even the relationship between subjectivism and objectivism, inner and outer, and so on. But I decided to pinpoint in my comments the under things, the things in the backbone, which is in the very title for both papers, the first one and this second one, which is the future of love, and how Brentano's realism at the same time is inner outer convergence should be programmed for the future of love, which I think is the main point of your paper, right? So I'm going to read it because it should be easier. Why do we philosophers ask ourselves so much about the future of love? Or rather, why it's only we philosophers who question the future of our field of knowledge? While engineers, physicists, and doctors all also inquire about the future of their fields, these inquiries are radically different from ours. A physician, for instance, wonders about the future of medicine in terms of envisioning its directions, the values that will guide it, or even its scope and its relationship with new technologies. Similarly, when a physicist questions the future of physics, their inquiry seeks to explore what advances and what paths the future holds for their fields. In other words, they do not ask about the future in the same way that we do. In general, when philosophers ask about the future of philosophy, there is something apocalyptic about it, as if philosophy is always on the verge of meeting its end around the next corner of history. Paraphrasing Heidegger, the future of philosophy is always tied to the possibility that it may no longer be possible. And why is this the case? One possible answer might be that the problems with which philosophy concerns itself are becoming irrelevant or are being resolved by other areas of knowledge. Indeed, this is Bertrand Russell's suggestion. In the problems of philosophy that you quote, mentioned by Professor Gabriel, Russell makes the following statement, and I quote, "As soon as definite knowledge concerning any subject becomes possible, this subject ceases to be called philosophy and becomes a separate science. The whole study of heavens, which now belongs to astronomy, was once included in philosophy. Newton's great work was called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. Similarly, the study of the human mind, which was a part of philosophy, has now been separated from philosophy and has become the science of psychology. Those questions, which are capable of definite answers, are placed in the sciences, while those to which, at present, no definite answer can be given, remain to form the residue which is called philosophy." End quote. Russell's quote. As can be inferred from Russell's words, the very scope, and therefore the future of philosophy, is to be the temporary guardian of problems until they are answered by one of the specific sciences. Once these problems can be subsumed into the specific sciences, philosophy then loses its objects. Another possible answer may lie not in the problem themselves, but in the answers. Philosophy is constantly concerned with its future because it must confront the fact that the answers it can provide are, in or way on another, unsatisfactory. This is due to several reasons that have been identified throughout the history of philosophy. Either because we have not reached a consensus on what the best answers would be, or because these answers can always be challenged and ultimately threatened by different forms and degrees of skepticism, or because we derive few, if any, practical consequences from them, especially when compared to the technological derivatives we obtain from natural sciences. This problematic outlook on the future of philosophy was radicalized precisely in the second half of 19th century, the focus of much of our interest during this conference, with the collapse of a certain foundationalist conception of philosophy and the advance of the science of natural sciences, which, as Profª shows, created, and I quote, a civilization of natural sciences, end quote. If we now look at 19th and 20th century philosophy, how 19th and 20th century philosophy dealt with questions concerning the future of philosophy, particularly those who see some future and specificity for it, it seems that many of the responses assert philosophy's unique role as a kind of aggregator or unifier between poles of human experience and epistemological production. In a conference with a suggestible title, Der Begriff der Philosophie als Problem der Philosophie, the concept of philosophy as a philosophical problem, Cassirer summarizes the task of philosophy and seems to respond to Russell, to the Russell quote I mentioned earlier, as follows, and I quote Cassirer. But even if all these particular investigations were successful in leading to a definite end, philosophy would still not be at the end of its own problem. For a final, decisive question still remains, which lies beyond all these particular theoretical analysis, which arises at their limit and which, as soon as it has been once been clearly and sharply put, necessarily goes beyond this limit. Philosophy cannot be satisfied to ask about the form and structure of particular cultural regions, about the structure of language, art, law, myth, and religion. The deeper it penetrates into this structure, the more clear and the more urgent becomes the problem of the whole for it. What is this whole of spiritual culture? What is its end, its goal, its meaning? Whenever this question of goal and meaning is put to the whole of culture, we stand at a decisive turning point of philosophical self-reflection, end quote. In a manner quite similar to Cassirer, Wilfried Sellars assigns philosophy a very similar task, and I quote, for the philosopher is confronted not by one complex many-dimensional picture, the unity of which, such as it is, he must come to appreciate, but by two pictures of essentially the same order of complexity, each of which purports to be a complex picture of man in the world, and which, after separate scrutiny, he must fuse into one vision. Philosophy's task would be sort of fusion of these two pictures of man in the world. Namely, let me refer to these two perspectives respectively as the manifest and the scientific images of man in the world, end quote. Sellars is arguing that whenever you ask someone what's the best image of the world that we have, and the most sophisticated, the more accurate image, and everybody should say, or at least one expects that one should say that it's the scientific image. The world is made after atoms or subatomic particles and energy and so on, but nobody lives in this world, right? We live in the words of not the nets, but in a world of desks, right? The philosophy task will be by excellence to aggregate or to unify those two visions, which is really close to your proposal, if I don't get it wrong. We could also mention Hans Blumenberg and the distinction between a Weltbild and a Weltmodell. Or finally, as Professor Gabriel suggests, when comparing Brentano's reason, a blend, and I quote, a blend of substantialist outlook and phenomenological methods. A conjunction of inner, and I quote it again, inner and outer experiences, or points of view, or standpoints. Even Professor Susan Gabriel's final reminder, namely, and we find ourselves philosophically more attracted to the inner or the outer view let us not forget the lessons of the others. The book. It suggests a fragmentation of human experience that philosophy would be tasked with remedying. Well, I have a couple questions, but this one is the main one. If, for the sake of the argument, we set aside for now certain positions like physicalism, how is it truly possible to carry out this task of philosophy, like for real, upon which its future seems to depend? And I'm not referring here to how we construct a theoretical model of unity, something often done throughout the history of philosophy, right? Systems trying to unify our experience of the world. But how do we actually make philosophy meaningful for the whole of culture? For those two separate countries, or like cities knows, just the two cultures. What is its one-sided separable part, to mention Brentano's approach? What is philosophy one-sided separate part, which we cannot live without in our future? I think this kind of question is way more easy to do than to answer.
It's easier to raise. Sorry. Thank you, Gabriel. It's easier to raise the question than to answer it. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think you said two questions. I'm not sure I got the second.
The first one is what is this one-sided separate part of philosophy that we must maintain, blending these two approaches that you suggested, and how once we are well succeeded in doing that, how it can be like really meaningful to culture. I mean, in this scientific outer culture that we have nowadays.
Okay, I'm not entirely sure where to start. I like everything that you said. It's very interesting and apropos. It is quite true, to begin with his early remarks, that I didn't address, and can't probably, whether Connell's reading of Aristotle is correct. I also should confess that I stole the title The Future of Philosophy from Brentano. So he wrote a piece called The Future of Philosophy, and I thought that was a good title, but it's theft. It is true that philosophy is unique in being concerned with its future, I think because of the advances of science and technology. The famous quote from Russell that Gabriel mentioned, that philosophy only deals with the residue left over after science and technology have been through and answered all our questions. That's a very prevalent view, I think, and people roll their eyes, non-philosophers roll their eyes when you say that you're studying philosophy. Oh yeah, that, it's abstract, it's abstruse, it's remote from my life. And that is a problem, I think. It is a problem for us who like philosophy anyway. It may even be as bad as Heidegger has said, which is even worse than the residue comment. The apocalyptic view of Heidegger, that philosophy which might be over with, except for a few strange people studying strange works of strange thinkers from the past. I think part of the problem is that we are so scientifically oriented that we tend to expect progress or else dump it, If there's progress in physics, that's what physicists expect, and they don't worry about it because they've been making steady progress for a long, long time. If you were to look at Aristotle in terms of his scientific claims, you would immediately notice that we've made huge progress in science since the time of Aristotle. And we likewise made huge progress in philosophy. I don't think that we're accustomed to thinking of an area of study, which philosophy is, as something that doesn't necessarily make the kind of progress that has been made in science. If it's modern, it's better. My students tend to think of that. They use expressions like, well, in today's world, Well, there's a sense in which Aristotle lived in today's world. than, philosophy, I think, is a way of living in the world. And that means the culture that we have and all kinds of things that are permanent throughout history and things that change throughout history, both of them. I don't know about the collapse of foundationalism. Is that a thing?
I think that meta philosophy, as we know nowadays, is a product of 19th century law. The question of asking about what philosophy should be or what is proper object and methods, as we understand meta philosophy nowadays, it's a product of 19th century, mainly because of some sort of collapse of kind of foundationalist view of philosophy.
Like foundationalist epistemology.
Yeah, and that philosophy should provide for instance, natural sciences, the metaphysical basis or metaphysical presuppositions. Like I think we can see Hegel as the last guardian of this kind of view. From his death on, this kind of views kind of abandoned. So we have to, what should we do with this philosophy thing?
So it's sort of a problem like Neurath's boat. You're out on the ocean and you have to make a boat out of some stuff, you hope. I guess I don't accept the anti-foundationalist view. I think there are clear starting points, and some of them come from perception and some of them come from mentally, come from thinking about things. That philosophy should unify the different views that we have and overcome the kind of fragmentation of human experience. For instance, on the one hand, you've got Neurath's boat. On the other hand, you have some kind of dogmatism about things. That makes me speculate, I guess, that the inseparable proper part of philosophy actually is that questioning attitude. You have to, was it Plato that said philosophy begins in wonder? If you don't have anything to wonder about, then you probably should get into another area of study. But if you do wonder about things, if you do wonder about the questions that we've heard of in the paper on Lao-Tzu and the paper on Mana, whether Kant was right that human dignity is unassailable and metaphysically founded. Those are real living questions, it seems to me. I would worry if people thought that they were answered once and for all.
I'll play the devil's advocate here, because when you go to a lab or you talk to a physician, I give philosophy classes for medicine school, and when you talk to like brain surgeons, this kind of people, they think, oh, philosophy. No, of course we have like theoretical presuppositions and so on, and it's quite nice. But I mean, in the very moment I'm open to this skull, I mean, it's absolutely vanishes. I mean, I really don't need to think about my phenomenological perspective during a brain surgery and so on. And it's a very, like, of course, I don't kill the messenger. I'm not saying that I under science this kind of thing, but at the same time, this whole question about the future of philosophy and how to approach it in the domain of the whole culture and even our pragmatic problems we're very bad philosophers in matching all of us, in matching those guys, at least in the halfway. I mean, because when you talk to them, they're like, sometimes they're really interested into philosophy, but when you start to say that, well, when you're doing chemistry or biology, you're presupposing a lot of philosophical standpoints and this and that, and they think it's very interesting, but they say, okay, let's get a coffee and talk about that. But I mean,
yes, philosophy has puzzles, for instance.
kind of, yeah.
And so, let's say somebody is in medical school to become a surgeon, and they get interested in the question whether there's a mind behind the brain. Or is it just a brain, or is there a mind or a soul? No, that's distinct. Yes, it's quite understandable that such a person would lose interest. I mean, I might be interested all day and all night, but well, but if philosophy is a way of living in the world, which is what I think, then meet people where they are. Nobody escapes ethical issues. And ethics is the interface, it seems to me. I wasn't really talking about ethics here, except a little bit with regard to the Kantian idea of human dignity. It's there from either the objective or the subjective standpoint, it seems to me. Objectively, questions about virtue and the common good. Subjectively, questions about human dignity and so forth. But your brain surgeon is not going to escape ethical issues. And they remain philosophical because there's what I call moral anguish. A good person can be genuinely confused about what to do. I read a very interesting article by a physician, it was in the Globe, I think, who had to operate on a young woman's brain where a tumor was growing that was going to threaten not only her mental acuity, but her life ultimately. And he's in there operating, and he's comparing the difference between a robot doing this operation, or do they call them robots? Well, anyway, robotic surgery, or a human physician doing it. And he said it occurred to him that the robot has a goal to get rid of the tumor. The physician also has the goal of getting rid of the tumor, but with ancillary considerations being extremely important. He got to the point in the operation where if he were to take the next step in the surgery to completely remove the tumor, there was serious risk involved of the patient coming out of the operating room alive. And he said, the difference between me and a robot is that I can say to myself, if this were my daughter, do I want her to come out possibly dead, or do I want her to come out with the possibility that the tumor comes back and we have to deal with it again, but she'd be okay? That's an ethical conundrum, and it seems to me it's precisely philosophical thinking that helps you to get through it. And by the way, he decided to only go so far as was safe with the operation. I don't think you get away with it, get away from it, I mean to say. Consider the situation in Gaza. Is anyone really justified in bombing apartment buildings and hospitals in order maybe to eliminate some terrorists and certainly to eliminate whole families? Or other military type conundrum that people come across. Suppose there's a sniper at the top of a hospital. Do you go after him and risk killing people and innocent people in the hospital? Is that justified and so on? And it doesn't have to be that dramatic or military or medical or anything like that. Do I explain to my daughter that I think she's taking her supervisor too seriously? Or do I let her figure that out for herself, which is better? That can be tough. I mean, I can solve your problems for you, kid, or else you make your mistakes and learn that way. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, and I totally agree personally. That's why I said that I was playing the devil's advocate, because every now and then I participate in discussion around in hospitals with students and physicians. And in the end of the day, they say, well, that's a very straightforward way to solve these bioethical questions here in hospital. Let's ask the lawyers. Oh, no, I'm being 100% accurate. this whole bioethics thing is quite okay, but they're only trying to not get sued.
Yes,
So,
and it happens in academia too, you know, if we don't hire this person, they'll sue us for discrimination.
Yeah.
Or, yeah,
Then it's quite, and every now and then I found myself trying to push the boundaries in order to, well, okay, well, I mean, you cannot reduce all your ethical considerations in a surgery or in a kind of procedure only to what is legal or not, because even what is legal or not is mainly debatable in terms of moral right and wrongs and so on, and these kind of things. They absolutely concede. They say, okay, I totally agree. Let's have a coffee and talk about it. But for the decision, they're really not into these philosophical questions because they presuppose. That's what I think about it. They presuppose certain cultural background, which no matter how you can argue or demonstrate being rational in your justification of your positions, because in the end of the day, it's a matter of pragmatical decisions like being sued or not, and these kind of things. So once again, and I'm thinking Martin Nussbaum's book, Not for Profit, for instance, when she's trying to defend philosophy, in this not for profit, she defends philosophy on the basis that democracy needs critical thinking, and critical thinking is something that is fostered by philosophy, so therefore we need philosophy, which is,
I agree.
sorry, I agree with it, I mean, as an argument. I don't think it's a good one because it makes philosophy dependent on how much we value democracy. So if we do not value democracy, so we don't need philosophy. So it makes philosophy dependent on a third thing, right? So, but why I mentioned Nussbaum, because it's one of these strategies to make philosophy great again. But in the end of the day, I mean, it presupposes what it should be discussing. Presupposes the value of critical thinking, the value of democracy, the value of and that's precisely the point that these guys like my friend, brain surgeon, they don't want to discuss.
Okay, so I'd be inclined to say that the value of critical thinking is self-evident, but that's not going to satisfy very many people. It's self-evident to me, big deal. Well, there are escape hatches. I had said before that you can't escape ethical dilemmas, roughly. But of course, you can try, and the legal route is one of those. It can be difficult in the classroom to get across the idea that what's legal and what's right are not the same, or let's say not necessarily the same. There's an Irish attitude toward the law, which is about roughly as follows: if the law makes sense, obey it. If not, don't, you know. And that's one way of...
It's the same here.
Is that right? Oh dear, really? Years ago, there was a device called the Palm Pilot, you know, and you could plug in all kinds of data if you want. And I used to imagine doing that with ethical issues. Plug in all the factors, you know, and it comes up with an answer. And I would tell my students, that's cool, you know, what would be neat if you could do that, and it tells you what to do, but here's the problem. You are on the front lines. You have to decide whether you accept the deliverance of the Palm Pilot. You have to decide whether the answer that he gives you is the correct one, and are you going to have to take responsibility for agreeing with it? So, but that's just me. I think you can't escape a philosophy, especially in the area of ethics. But it's also true that it seems to me philosophy is one of those things that's part of civilization. In addition, art, religion, science, literature. It's not the case that everybody has to do all of them, right? And I don't think the future of philosophy requires everybody to be persuaded that philosophy is a good and important thing. It does require that it be tolerated, like Shakespeare, first let's kill all the lawyers. No, first let's kill all the philosophers. No, the artists, the musicians, literature. We need it all. And beyond that, I'm not sure I have a defense that would be accepted by everybody.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Gabriel. Thank you, Professor Sun, for your answer. We'll now move to the questions from the audience. And over there.
Hi, Susan. My name is Daniel. Thank you for your presence here. I've been thinking about what's your opinion about with all pressures that you have to split more the knowledge, right? How the science does to be more specifically studies in each science. How do you think that to improve the cross knowledge education, like to build more, philosophers that are also scientists that are more philosophers? How do you believe that this cross education can improve the way that the scientists think in the philosopher way, and the philosopher become more scientists and go deep in the knowledge that the science does as well? Because I feel that we are, walking to more split the gap, right? To improve the gap that we have between the areas where I believe that we need to try more to see the whole, right? To unify those knowledge. Besides the analytics and the continental, I believe that we are more creating a bigger gap between the scientist and the philosopher, right? So how do you believe that education can play a role to unify more that knowledge?
And that's very interesting. I think that over-specialization and division of labor to the point that a physician specializes in the left big toe is a real problem in our culture. And it seems to me that philosophy is well equipped to encourage people to take a larger view and not just think about just one thing. It's also true, I agree with you, that philosophers need to take science into account, respect it, because it does make a difference in our understanding of the world that we live in. There's no question about that. Anything that broadens the scope and acts against over-specialization seems to me to be to the good. As educators, it seems to me that's what we're doing. But we're not necessarily the only ones doing it. The humanities in general have that tendency.
Sorry, one add. But we believe that with the pressure they have for the workforce, for the companies, right, for the enterprise, we believe that we are able today to make this move. Because I feel that's almost impossible to convince, right, the marketing and of course, the education institutions that are more related to what the market asks, be able to do this cross education. So how do you see this move?
It's a huge problem in the United States because people are always asking, if college is so expensive, what's the cash value in the end? And how is my kid going to make a living with a major like philosophy? Exactly one time in my 35 years of teaching, I had a father call me in my office on the phone, and he said, listen, I think my son is majoring in business to please my wife and me. Please, when you see him, tell him that if he wants to major in English, he should go ahead. I thought, yeah, gladly. But see, that's unusual. And that it's a cultural problem. I'm not sure how to solve it except to be a serious advocate for the humanities. And I guess I would also include the social sciences. They can help in this project as well. The over-specialization probably exists there. It exists in philosophy as well. I mean, some philosophers are focused only on, well, there's a funny thing. Obviously, I've focused on Brentano for a long time. And when I give a colloquium up at my school, which I usually do, but like every other year, I'll advertise it in advance and say, guaranteed, no Brentano in this talk. And then every time I break my promise because there's always something. So I could be devoted to Brentano to the exclusion of everything else, and that would be a bad thing. There's another kind of fragmentation within philosophy. It's not just analytic continental, which you know the problems with that distinction. But there are other subsets. Historians of philosophy are distinct from people who focus on contemporary issues. And the so-called neo-Thomists or neo-scholastics, who are, for one reason or another, largely excluded, from the rest of the philosophical world, as though they were just some sort of antiquarian, backward-looking types, and of course they're not necessarily. But we've done it in philosophy as well. We're quite fragmented, and that's a shame, I think.
Thank you. Professor Evandro, in the back.
No. Oh. Yeah.
Thank you very much about this so interesting analysis of Brentano's theory of mereology. And it's, for us, it's a gift. And I'd like with a simple question, if it's possible. Could you say some word more about the role of Brentano's conception of physical phenomena in this theory of categories of Brentano? My thoughts that in the beginning of his life, Brentano used the conception of phenomena that was taken from Auguste Comte.
Yes.
And this concept is used to describe all phenomena of physical, natural science. But he used the same structure to formulate the concept of psychical phenomena. Well, when we analyze the last theory of Brentano, like the mereological theory, we can find another description of the relations of art and world. And my question is, there are in this theory, mereological theory, a place to this conception of Kantian, Auguste Comte conception of phenomena?
And actually, Brentano admired Comte quite a bit, and in many ways followed along his path of how shall we say, accounting for phenomena and regularities among phenomena, the laws according to which phenomena follow one another and so forth. But where you find the disagreement between Brentano and Comte is partly in psychology, where Brentano insists that there is this material, non-physical self that perceives the phenomena. In other words, what we call a mind or a soul. And also, he didn't agree with Comte that you can't reason from phenomena back to an ultimate cause. So in the lectures on God's existence that Brentano gave mostly in Würzburg and in Vienna into the 1890s, see a couple of things. First of all, that from phenomena in nature, you can assume, similar to Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas, that there's a first mover and so on. That if things are contingent, something must be necessary. And that would go beyond what Comte would allow. And then there's the so-called psychological proof of immateriality of the soul. Brentano disagreed with what he said that called rather the semi-materialism of Plato and Aristotle, where the human being is a body with a soul. He more thought of the soul as being the person. And that too goes beyond Comte. So I don't know if that answers your question properly. He had a similar disagreement with Mill. And it's essentially a metaphysical disagreement, with Brentano favoring the metaphysical outlook that both Comte and Mill kind of set to the side. Does that speak to your question?
Oh, yes. The points conception of Britannia's metaphysics of the second part of life, and all if this meteorological theory can unify and two fields of science, human science and natural science, under a general conception. That's why I asked about the concept of phenomenon. I want to understand how the science can still present in the work of Profª.
Well, he was, I don't know if this helps at all, but he was very interested in scientific developments. He was up on mathematics, probability theory, the developments in physics of his time, discovery of Neptune and things like that. He was very interested in and very well acquainted with. Also, Darwin, he did not question the evolution of species or anything like that. It was just that when he discussed the evolution of species, it's not just the phenomena that are observable, but also what's unobservable, namely, as Brentano would say, that there must be an intelligence behind evolution. So a lot of respect for science and a value for the progress that's made when you take that phenomenal view of phenomena and paying attention to phenomena. But where he draws the line is when it prevents you from going further to things that cannot be observed. There's also another problem, of course, which is that, as I noted in the paper, things cannot be said with certainty to be as we perceive them. Yeah, and so with the reism, those appearances, those phenomena get absorbed into the person's perceiving, and that's a difference too, I think, between him and Comte.
So there's one question here from the audience. Okay, so
Hello, Pastor Susan. My name is Gabriel. I would like to ask you about one point about Brentano. What make it possible for Brentano to talk about a non-spatial substance within ourselves in the categories? It is something about the mereological approach, or is something based upon inner perception?
It's based on inner perception, and what inner perception teaches us, according to Brentano, is that it is the same entity who now sees and now hears and now loves or desires or wills. And the problem of delegating those functions to, for instance, to different parts of the brain is that there would be no one entity that does them all. There might also be a problem of distinguishing your thoughts from someone else's thoughts, but I think we can set that aside. It's the unity of consciousness. And that plays a big role too in his so-called psychological proof of God's existence, which depends on the immateriality of the soul. But the God factor wouldn't need to play a role in simply the immateriality of the soul. That's entirely based on what inner perception teaches us about the unity of consciousness.
Thank you.
De nada.
Okay, so we have a question here.
Thanks for your speech. Very nice and interesting. Let me go back to the question in regard to the, let's say, shaping the future, looking to university as a way to shaping the philosophy future. I was interested in when you said that philosophy has not leveraging or improving its position since 2015 years ago, or the 2,500 years ago. But I mean, this is interesting because we have been studying this and we haven't evaluating this that much. And but looking to our scenario today, the question is hard to make, but let's see how the universities in the US works or stimulates the competence of people to thinking better to take their decisions. Let me be more precise. I've been working for many years in companies in borders, and when I'm looking, I try to remember how the decisions were taken. In some reasons or in some ways, the decisions are somehow shelves. They don't really go in deep to discuss the impact of the decisions, the risk of the decisions, and so on and so forth. If you have it's not a computer, but a good relationship between universities, inviting professors to be part of these discussions, it will be better. So in this concept, how the university stimulates companies, because one of the sponsors of many companies sponsor the university. How is supposed to be, or is a plan to involve philosophers or professors or students to be part of these good discussions of business, to take good discussions?
Yes, I think I understand it. If I wander off in the wrong direction, let me know. At my college, we have what should we say, a center for ethics and public policy, which aims to do exactly that sort of thing. And I think they've had some success. At any rate, they have support from the institution. And I'm sure it's not unique to our little college. I think there are, just as there are in hospitals, ethics advisors who help to think through some of the medical issues that come up. Likewise, at a lot of colleges and universities, there would be some outreach to the general public. As far as business in particular, we do have, and I'm sure lots of places have, courses in business ethics. But here's a problem, at least from my perspective. The pressure from the departments of business is always to if there's a requirement in ethics, for instance, for all students, if it's a business major, let them just take business ethics, not regular ethics, not, the history of ethics. And personally, I'd rather see both, because although theory is not the most important thing in ethics, it is of some significance. whether you're making your decisions based on consequences or principle, for instance. I also think that there's interest on the part of a lot of businesses to be more involved in thinking about these things carefully. Part of it is environmental, and environmental ethics is a player in this as well. So I'm not all that cynical about business that they're only in it to make money or something like that. I think a lot of businesses want to contribute to the common good, and critical thinking and ethics are parts of that, which is, you might say, kind of a mission for a lot of teachers of philosophy. I think it's coming along in the U.S., but also rampant capitalism is a real issue. And we don't, in my opinion, we have laissez-faire capitalism to too much of an extent. We don't have enough regulation of business, and there's always pressure against that. But not necessarily from the businesses per se, from the wealthy maybe. I mean, it's complicated, but the socialism of Lange has not exactly taken hold in the United States. Does that address your question at least? Thank you.
Okay, so we have 3 more questions from the audience. First, starting with Professor Chiara, then Professor Hugh. Please, Professor Chiara.
Yeah, thank you for your talk and the discussion. I will try to formulate something coherent as much as I can, because in this talk and the one this is a part 2. So as I get it from the part 1, your attempt was like showing that it is possible to bridge these divides in philosophy between like continental and analytic philosophy, or this subjectivist or objectivist approach. But I don't know, I would say, I think it is an inherent problem of philosophy that since we are not science and we have to do with these conundrums, puzzles, almost unsolvable questions, we are always going to have debates, different positions, and it is impossible to say who is right and who is wrong. Otherwise, it wouldn't be philosophy; it would be science. But I think our problem is also that this is also related to the issue of the future of philosophy, not only like generally speaking, but very concretely speaking, also in terms of the future of philosophy in the universities, because as you know, a lot of like philosophy departments are closing around the world. And I think that the problem is that the fact that we live on debates almost plays against us in defending our positions, because even, for example, about the analytic continental divide, we were always find one side like talking bad about the other side and saying this is useless stuff because it is literature and not science, or because it's just mental puzzles that you create for your own fun. So is it really possible to bridge these divides in philosophy and have like this unitary position also to defend our future in front of the shaping of the university of the future that looks for solutions that we are not able to provide? Because even the ethical issues, we may provide some clarity, but we have no answer what is the better answer in many cases. So, because I don't think that philosophy is about solutions and answers. I think it's about debates and problems and endless discussions. So how can we defend ourselves when our own role is not about delivering answers in a way?
I think it's part of our scientific culture that we want the answers. You know, what's an electron? What's a proton? We want to be able to memorize the facts and pass the number 2 lead pencil test. You know, let's see. What you say is true, of course. Just going back to the questionable analytic continental divide. it's real, I think, as I said before. And there's a tendency on the analytic side, what we generally call the analytic side, to be a little removed from ordinary life, take it an extreme symbolic logic. I was looking at a book by one of my most admired professors, Phil Quinn, called Divine Commands and Moral Requirements. I remember hearing him talk about it, and I have the book and I look in it and it's all symbolic logic. I'm thinking unto myself, there's a sense in which the precision of symbolic logic loses detail, and the kind of detail that you get in literature or that you get in non-mathematical kinds of writing is just gone. So anyway, at that extreme, you might say, well, analytic philosophers, could you be a bit more humanistic? And then think of the extreme continentalists. Could you be a little more clear? Could you be a little more intelligible? You're very humanistic, you know. Levinas or whoever it is, I'm sorry, I can't remember for sure, goes on at great length about the demands of the flesh. Okay, but I get lost, you know. So it does seem to me that the schools of philosophy that we have now are such that some correction, some movement in the other direction, some listening to the other would really be helpful. And in the case of Neo-Thomism or Neo-Scholasticism, don't exclude these people. Listen, you know, and they too wouldn't have to reject the godless analytical philosophy, well, not all godless, unfortunately. They wouldn't have to reject the other contemporary philosophical schools. Well, but the questions are essential, and a tolerance for not ambiguity really, but lack of final answer seems to me to be a life skill that could be beneficial to all of us. You know, we have to live in a world where we don't know everything, and yet we have to act. So that seems to me to be a value that philosophy can share with others, whether they like it or not. I don't know. Does that answer address the question?
Yeah, yes.
Just one thing about it. I think we are culturally so rotten that, no, really, that, for instance, take astrophysics. Astrophysics, nobody has a clue about astrophysics connection with daily life, right? And nobody cares. I mean, it's something that people, if you think about, for instance, the differentiation between usefulness and fruitfulness concerning knowledge, concerning which goes to a pure and applied science distinction, right? So on the one hand, you have this fruitfulness, just usefulness, and on the other hand, you have this fruitfulness. It expands, and everybody concedes that sophisticated astrophysics is important, is worthwhile because it's fruitful. And everybody's okay with that. But when it comes to philosophy, when you say, okay, we don't have definite answers, we're going to have this struggle forever, but at the same time, we are expanding our knowledge. It's like, it's an idea that I got from Massimo Spiliucci approach on progress of philosophy. I think he's right. Philosophy makes progress in the same way that a composer, when he is composing a musical piece, if you ask him, are you progressing? He's not progressing towards an end, a definite a priori end that he knows in advance, but he can measure it in somehow in saying, yes, I'm progressing. I'm expanding my understanding of this musical piece. And I think we concede this kind of fruitfulness for other areas, like really sophisticated chemistry, even sophisticated pure mathematics. Everybody likes, wow, mathematics, pure mathematics. How is it useful? Absolutely not useful, right? So, but people think that's awesome. But when it comes to philosophy, Windelband says something about that in his introduction to philosophy. When it comes to philosophy, philosophers cannot are not allowed to invent new words. Say, Windelband talks about that. Physicists invent new words to describe, but when it comes to philosophy, oh, you're using jargons, you're inventing new words, and well, all fields invent words, all fields reach these very sophisticated part of knowledge which has no connection with daily life at all, and so on. But why do we don't concede this kind of right to philosophy as well?
Okay, so we have a question from Professor Engelmann.
So I would just like to answer the question.
One is that philosophical words are basically different.
That's the answer.
And I think it's interesting what you say is that you are assuming the progress
Is the concept that should determine things.
now, taking this as the initial point, I ask you about the way you defended when you talked about the value of philosophy, you introduced ethics, right? And I wonder how far apart are you from Bertrand Russell? You know, the idea that philosophy deals with parts that of knowledge that science still hasn't controlled, so to speak, right? It seems that you're saying, oh, ethics is still important because science is not there, right?
That's not what I meant.
Right, I thought you did,
But I can see, what I was thinking is that when you're talking to people who are skeptical about philosophy or simply don't know anything about it or care about it, my neighbors, for instance, asked me what the heck I was doing in Brazil. Can you tell us about your paper? Yeah, I could, but you'll fall asleep. But I can communicate talking about ethical issues. The idea that some kind of question recurs and doesn't have a final answer. It's easier to make that point in ethics. However, I think the questions, metaphysical questions and so forth, that scientists can't deal with, are still there. And Russell's very cynical remark about the residue, I disagree with. I really like what he says about truth. But the residue, no. I can understand how it feels that way because science has done so much. And in many ways, very beneficial, in other ways, questionable. You know, the advances in technology, for instance, AI and so forth. I have to keep an eye on that, and that's where ethics comes in partly. But the difference that Cannell harps on between an aggregate and an organism, that's very interesting. No scientific discovery is going to take away the interest in that issue. And substance, by the way, speaking of inventing words, the Greek ousia was, as you know, one word for that, which when Cicero had to get Latin words to accommodate Greek philosophy, he did have to make things up. Substance is one, you know. If you became a noun from the Greek, becomes substance in Latin, but you had to, you know, all this stuff, but you had to accommodate philosophical concepts in the language, even in ancient times. And if we still have to do it, fine. I think we should just do it. So I don't know if that speaks to what you said.
No, it doesn't. So you mean we should invent words?
I think it's fine to invent words, absolutely, because I think that thought precedes language, and language has got to accommodate thought somehow. You don't have anything lying around to make something up.
Right, making up words can be dangerous as well.
Well, and I take his point that even words that still exist, like parasitical, can be dangerous.
Oh, very much.
Okay, we have another question from the audience over there.
Your opinion.
It's off. Turn on.
Okay. Hi, morning. Your opinion, what's the best approach for us to talk about the companies and to establish a better communication to try to show the companies how it's important to show philosophy studies inside of the companies, because I cannot see any evolution about this inside of the companies. What's your opinion about this? How can I include it, okay, in the calendar, in the agenda of the companies, this kind of things?
Thank you. That actually, I've thought about that somewhat. My stepdaughter was a philosophy major at my college. She did well in philosophy. She now owns a large and successful marketing company. And one of the things that she's been able to do in marketing, I think, is, as we say, think outside the box, or have some kind of open-mindedness about problems and flexibility and thinking about problems that comes from, I think, from exercising your mind in certain ways, especially at a certain age. If you watch 18 to 22-year-old kids, which is what we teach in the US anyway, big change from 19 to 20 or around in that area. And it's very important, it seems to me, that they be exposed at those ages to all kinds of different things. In other words, this isn't quite answering your question yet, but just my viewpoint. Don't choose your major right away. Don't tell kids you can't go for college until you decide on a major. No, forbid them to decide on a major field until they've studied a lot of things. So it seems to me it should be possible to sell the idea to companies that, for instance, a liberal arts undergraduate degree is very valuable for dealing with the changing kind of world that we live in, the technological changes, sociological changes, a nimble mind that's produced by, it seems to me, the humanities more so than the STEM or technical fields, ought to be prized by a lot of companies. And it's something we can offer. I don't know if that would, sell. In the immortal words of William James, what's the cash value of that? I'm not sure, but anyway, that's what I would say. And I think a number of CEOs of companies are seeing that.
Do you have any success experience about this? Do you know about someone that had some good experience about to do this kind of approach with the companies?
No, I don't. In other words, like an ambassador to the companies. In the US, it's a huge cultural problem, I think, again, because people are saying college costs so much, and I want my kid to be able to make money so I can live with them when I'm old, or whatever. It's an issue. I would say American culture is, to a certain extent, by comparison with Europe and South America, anti-intellectual. And you see this in the classroom. I used to teach small seminars and raise questions and have conversation among the students, And if I were to ask a question, and some student were to go like this, even though we didn't have to raise hands in that class, but I'd say, okay, yeah, Joe, what do you think? And he gives a clever response. The other students will say, hey, way to go. You're charming, our little logic teacher. So, people get put, yeah. So respect for intellectual things is a little bit difficult to achieve culturally in the US. I can remember being a young teacher and realizing that my students' parents, who would pass through occasionally, really want their kids to end up like me. They want them to have lucrative jobs.
Sorry, the last one. Do you have some tips about the best research for us to study more about this, how to talk better with the companies?
You know, I would ask the company people themselves, you know, what are you interested in? What are you looking for? Who's your ideal employee? Have you had, what students with what sorts of majors, you know, have you hired and what was your experience been? Because I wouldn't know how to talk to them until I know what they're up to and what they want, you know what I mean? Certainly they're interested in the quality of the employee, right? And unless I know what that consists in, I would have a hard time focusing on the things that an education in the humanities provides that speak to that. But I'm sorry, I don't have. I was never an ambassador to businesses. I just have that personal experience from my stepfather.
Okay, thank you, Professor Susan. Thank you, Professor Gabriel, for the debating. And thank you for auditorium audience and for online audience as well. And we'll resume tomorrow with the fourth day with a talk by Professor Juliet Frey. Thank you.